The bitter wind cut across the ridge trail like a razor, turning the once familiar path into an unrecognizable white void as Kade Anderson squinted against the onslaught of ice and snow. He had been a fool to push on when the first flakes began to fall, but stubbornness had always been his downfall. Montana Territory, 1875. Winter had come early to the mountains, and with a vengeance that surprised even the most weather-hardened locals. Kade had been riding from Silver Creek to Fort Benton with supplies, a journey he'd made countless times in his 30 years, but never in conditions that deteriorated so quickly. His horse, Rusty, a sturdy chestnut gelding, trudged forward with his head bowed against the wind. The temperature had dropped so fast that Kade's breath formed icicles in his mustache, and his gloved fingers felt numb despite the thick leather. "Just a bit further, boy," he muttered, though he wasn't sure where further was anymore. The landmarks he relied on had vanished under the snow, and the howling wind disoriented his sense of direction. That's when he heard it faint but unmistakable, the creak of wood, and the startled whinny of a horse that wasn't his own. Kade reined in Rusty, listening intently despite the wind's interference. There it was again, off to his right, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. He turned Rusty toward the sound, moving cautiously. The visibility was poor, no more than a few feet ahead, but as he approached, the dark outline of an overturned wagon emerged from the white curtain of snow. "Hello," he called out, his voice immediately snatched away by the wind. "Anyone there?" A horse, still harnessed to the wagon but lying on its side, had stopped struggling. Kade dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. The poor animal was dead, probably from the cold or from injuries sustained in whatever accident had befallen the wagon. "Hello." He called again, louder this time. A faint sound answered him, barely perceptible above the storm. Kade moved around the wagon, finding where it had tipped into a shallow ravine. There, huddled against the exposed underside, was a young woman. She was conscious but shivering violently, her dress and coat woefully inadequate for the blizzard that had descended on them. Her face was pale, her lips blue with cold, and she looked at him with both fear and desperate hope. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice quavering. "I thought I'd die out here." "Not today," Kade said, kneeling beside her. "Can you tell me your name, madam?" Madeline," she said through chattering teeth. "Madeline Kincaid. I'm Kade Anderson. We need to get you warm, Miss Kincaid. This blizzard's not letting up." She tried to stand but collapsed against him, her strength gone. Without hesitation, Kade shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, though the coat added considerable weight. "My things," she protested weakly, gesturing toward the wagon. "They'll have to wait," Kade said firmly. "Your life is worth more than whatever's in that wagon." He carried her to Rusty, who stood patiently despite the worsening storm. With some effort, he managed to get her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, holding her securely against his chest. "There's an old line shack about a mile from here," he said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the wind. "If I'm right about where we are, we should be able to reach it before this storm gets any worse." She nodded weakly, too cold to speak, and Kade urged Rusty forward, guiding him through the blinding snow by instinct more than sight. The horse seemed to sense the urgency of their situation and moved steadily despite the difficult conditions. Madeline leaned against him, her body gradually absorbing some of his warmth through the coat. He could feel her shivering slowly subside, which relieved him. The deadly cold of a Montana winter was nothing to take lightly. The journey to the line shack seemed interminable. The blizzard intensified, the wind driving snow into their faces with brutal force. Kade kept one arm firmly around Madeline, the other holding the reins, his body sheltering hers as much as possible. When at last the dark shape of the small cabin appeared through the white haze, Kade nearly shouted with relief. The line shack was used by cowhands during the summer roundups, but abandoned in winter. It wasn't much, just a single room with a small stove, but it would be shelter from the storm. He dismounted carefully, keeping Madeline steady in the saddle, then lifted her down. Her legs buckled beneath her and he caught her, carrying her to the door. It was frozen shut, requiring him to kick it open with his boot. Inside was dark and cold, but blessedly free from the wind. Kade set Madeline down on a rough wooden bench, keeping his coat wrapped around her. "Stay put," he instructed. "I need to take care of my horse and get a fire going." She nodded, her eyes following him as he went back outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow without his coat, but he worked quickly, leading Rusty to the lean-to at the side of the cabin that served as a makeshift stable. He removed the saddle and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of old straw he found there, making sure the animal was as comfortable as possible. When he returned to the cabin, his fingers were numb and his face felt frozen, but Madeline looked up at him with such gratitude that he barely noticed his own discomfort. "Thank you," she said simply. Kade nodded and set about preparing a fire. Luckily, the previous occupants had left a small stack of firewood beside the stove, along with some kindling and matches in a tin box on the shelf. His hands were shaking from cold as he arranged the kindling, but soon he had a small flame going, which he carefully nurtured into a proper fire. As warmth began to fill the small space, Kade finally had a chance to look more closely at the woman he had rescued. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with rich auburn hair escaping from beneath a woolen cap. Her face, though pale from cold, showed delicate features and large eyes the color of a summer sky. She was beautiful, he realized with some surprise, though at the moment she looked more like a half-drowned kitten than a society belle. "How are you feeling?" he asked, moving to sit beside her on the bench. "Better, thanks to you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. What were you doing out in this weather, if you don't mind my asking?" she sighed, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "The storm caught me by surprise. I was traveling to Fort Benton to take a position as a schoolteacher. The driver I hired said we could make it before the weather turned, but—" she gestured helplessly. "The wagon hit something under the snow, a rock or a stump, and overturned. The driver was thrown clear, but he didn't survive the fall. I tried to help him, but there was nothing I could do." Her voice broke on the last words, and Kade saw tears well up in her eyes. Without thinking, he put a hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. "I'm sorry, Miss Kincaid. That's a terrible thing to witness," she nodded, wiping away a tear. "I covered him with my traveling blanket before taking shelter by the wagon. I thought someone might come along the trail, but then the snow got so heavy." She shuddered at the memory. "You did all you could," Kade assured her, "and you were right to wait by the trail even if it was a risk. It's how I found you." The fire was burning steadily now, casting a warm glow throughout the small cabin. Kade stood and explored the shelves, finding a dented pot, some coffee beans, and a few other basic supplies left by previous occupants. There was even a small pile of preserved foods, beans, jerky, and hardtack stored in metal containers to keep them safe from mice. "We're in luck," he said, holding up his finds. "We won't go hungry while we wait out the storm." "How long do you think that will be?" Madeline asked, watching as he filled the pot with snow from outside and set it on the stove to melt and heat. "Hard to say. These early winter storms can blow themselves out in a day or two, or they can last a week. We've got enough supplies for a few days, at least." The reality of their situation seemed to dawn on Madeline then. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she had just met, with no way to contact the outside world and no immediate prospect of leaving. She began, then hesitated. "This is rather irregular, isn't it?" Kade couldn't help but smile at her proper phrasing. "Miss Kincaid, there's nothing regular about a blizzard, but if it eases your mind, I promise to be a gentleman. My mother raised me better than to take advantage of a lady in distress." She returned his smile, though a bit uncertainly. "I'm not questioning your character, Mr. Anderson. You saved my life, after all. It's just that I've never been in such a compromising situation before." "Well, look at it this way," Kade said as he crushed coffee beans with the bottom of a tin cup. "If you're going to be a schoolteacher in Fort Benton, you'll need stories to impress the children. This one ought to do the trick." That drew a genuine laugh from her, a sound that brightened the dim cabin considerably. I suppose you're right, though I may have to omit certain details when telling the younger pupils. As night fell outside, the wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Kade had managed to prepare a simple meal of beans and jerky, which they ate sitting side by side on a bearskin rug he had found rolled up in the corner. It wasn't fancy dining, but it was hot and filling, and Madeline seemed grateful for it. "So, Mr. Anderson," she said as they sipped the strong, black coffee afterward, "what brings you out in this weather?" "Are you also headed to Fort Benton?" "I am," he confirmed. "I work as a guide and scout sometimes, but mainly I deliver supplies to the outlying ranches and military posts. I've got a wagon full of goods waiting in Silver Creek, but I rode ahead to check the trail conditions. Good thing I did, or I'd have a whole wagon train stuck in this mess. You know this area well then, like the back of my hand." "Been riding these trails since I was 15 when I first came west from Pennsylvania." "Pennsylvania," she looked at him with renewed interest. "I'm from Philadelphia myself. What brought you so far from home?" Kade hesitated, memories of his past rising unbidden. "The war," he said simply. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't stay. Too many ghosts." Understanding filled her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he assured her. "It was a long time ago. What about you? Philadelphia to Montana territory is quite a journey for a young woman on her own." She looked down at her coffee cup, her expression growing distant. "My parents died last year, influenza. I had been teaching at a small school in the city, but without them, there was nothing to keep me there. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Fort Benton, it seemed like a sign. A chance to start fresh somewhere new. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind," Kade observed, studying her with new respect, "or desperation," she countered with a wry smile. "The alternatives weren't appealing. My aunt suggested I find a husband quickly, preferably someone older and established who wouldn't mind taking on a penniless bride." "And you didn't fancy becoming some old man's nursemaid?" She laughed again, the sound warming him more than the fire. "No, I did not. I may not have much, Mr. Anderson, but I do have my independence. I intend to keep it." "Kade," he said suddenly. "If we're going to be snowbound together, you might as well call me Kade." She hesitated, then nodded. "And I'm Madeline, though my friends call me Maddie." "Maddie," he repeated, liking the way it sounded. "It suits you better than Madeline, less formal." "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not," she said, raising an eyebrow. "It is," he assured her. "Formality doesn't serve much purpose out here. The mountains don't care about proper forms of address." They talked well into the night, the conversation flowing easily between them despite their different backgrounds. Kade found himself telling her stories of his adventures in the West, encounters with bears, navigating treacherous mountain passes, the characters he had met in frontier towns. She, in turn, spoke of her life in Philadelphia, her love of teaching, and her dreams for the future. When Maddie finally began to nod off, Kade insisted she take the single narrow cot while he would sleep on the bearskin rug by the stove. "I can't take your coat and your bed," she protested. "The coat's yours until this storm passes," he said firmly. "And I've slept in far worse places than this floor. Besides, I'll need to keep the fire going through the night." Too exhausted to argue further, she accepted his offer and settled onto the cot, still wrapped in his buffalo coat. Kade added more wood to the stove, then stretched out on the rug, using his saddle as a pillow. Despite his assurances, the floor was hard and cold away from the immediate vicinity of the stove. He dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to add more wood to the fire and check on Maddie. Each time he found her sleeping peacefully, her auburn hair spread across the rough pillow, her face softened in slumber. Dawn brought no respite from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight. Kade opened the door just enough to see that snow had drifted halfway up the entrance, and visibility remained near zero. He closed it quickly to preserve the warmth they had built up inside. "We're not going anywhere today," he announced as Maddie stirred and sat up, looking disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. "How bad is it?" she asked, pushing her hair back from her face. Bad enough, but we're secure here. I'll check on Rusty and bring in more firewood. There's a good stack under the lean-to that should last us. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, Maddie had managed to find a comb in her pocket and was attempting to bring some order to her tangled hair. She looked embarrassed when she saw him watching. "I must look a fright," she said, putting the comb away. "You look like someone who survived a blizzard," he corrected her. "That's no small feat." She smiled gratefully at him, and something shifted in Kade's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. He busied himself with breakfast preparations, trying not to dwell on the feeling. The day passed slowly, marked by the mundane tasks of survival. They melted snow for water, rationed their food, and talked to pass the time. By unspoken agreement, they avoided personal topics that might lead to discomfort, sticking instead to safer subjects like books they had read and places they had visited. As evening approached again, Kade noticed Maddie shivering despite the fire and his coat. The temperature outside had dropped further, and the wind found every gap in the cabin's aging walls. "We might need to conserve body heat tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "It's going to get colder before morning." She looked at him with wide eyes, understanding his implication. "I'm not sure that would be proper." "Nothing improper about staying alive," Kade said gently. "I meant what I said yesterday. I'll be a gentleman, but hypothermia is a real risk on a night like this." Maddie bit her lip, considering. Finally, she nodded. "You're right, of course. Survival takes precedence over propriety." When it was time to sleep, they arranged themselves on the bearskin rug, which Kade had moved closer to the stove. He lay on his side, and after a moment's hesitation, Maddie settled in front of him, her back to his chest. He draped his coat over both of them, then cautiously put his arm around her waist, maintaining a respectful distance otherwise. "Is this all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered, her body gradually relaxing against his. "Thank you for saving my life, Kade. Get some sleep, Maddie. Tomorrow might bring better weather." But tomorrow brought only more snow, and the next day as well. They fell into a routine of sorts, sharing the small space with increasing comfort in each other's presence. Kade found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the way Maddie's eyes lit up when she laughed, to the quiet moments when they sat in companionable silence. On the fourth day, the storm finally began to abate. The wind died down first, then the snowfall became lighter, until by late afternoon, occasional patches of blue sky could be seen through the clouds. "We should be able to leave tomorrow if this holds," Kade said, looking out the door at the transformed landscape. Everything was buried under several feet of snow, pristine and untouched. "Yes," Maddie agreed, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. "I suppose we should try to recover my belongings from the wagon first." "Of course, and—" Kade hesitated, not wanting to upset her. "We should give the driver a proper burial if we can." She nodded solemnly. "I'd like that. He seemed like a decent man, even if his judgment about the weather was poor." That night, their last in the cabin, there was a strange tension between them. Both knew that their unusual intimacy was coming to an end, that once they returned to civilization, the proper distance between a single man and woman would have to be restored. "Will you come to Fort Benton after you've retrieved your supplies?" Maddie asked as they sat by the fire, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Eventually," Kade said. "I have deliveries to make along the way, but I should be there within a week or two." "I'll look for you then," she said quietly, "to thank you properly with a meal perhaps." "It's the least I can do." "I'd like that," he replied, finding that he meant it more than he had expected to. Morning dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off the snow with blinding brilliance. They prepared to leave, packing the few supplies that remained into Kade's saddlebags. Rusty seemed eager to be moving, prancing in the snow despite the burden he would have to carry. Kade helped Maddie mount, then swung up behind her. The snow was too deep for them to travel separately, and in any case, she would need the warmth of his body and his coat for the journey. They found the wagon where they had left it, now almost completely buried in snow. Using a shovel Kade had brought from the line shack, they dug out what they could of Maddie's belongings, a trunk containing clothes and books, and a smaller case with personal items. The driver's body, still covered by the blanket Maddie had placed over him, was stiff with cold but preserved by it as well. They worked together to dig a grave in the frozen ground, a difficult and time-consuming task. When it was done, Maddie said a few words over the man, whose name she had learned was Thomas Gibbs. Kade added a brief prayer, and they marked the grave with a cairn of stones that would remain visible even after the snow melted. With Maddie's trunk secured to Rusty's back and the smaller case tied to the saddle, they began the journey to Fort Benton. Progress was slow through the deep snow, but the day remained clear, and by mid-afternoon they had reached the main trail, which showed signs of having been traveled since the storm passed. "We should reach town by nightfall," Kade said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Maddie, seated in front of him, nodded but remained quiet. He could sense her withdrawing emotionally, preparing herself for their imminent separation. He found himself doing the same, though it left an unexpected hollowness in his chest. As predicted, the lights of Fort Benton came into view just as dusk was settling over the landscape. The frontier town was nestled along the Missouri River, its buildings sturdy against the harsh Montana winters. Smoke rose from chimneys, and lanterns glowed in windows, a welcome sight after their isolation. They rode directly to the schoolhouse, where the town had prepared living quarters for the new teacher. A small crowd gathered as they approached, curious about the newcomers arriving on horseback in the aftermath of the worst blizzard in recent memory. The school board president, a portly man named Harold Mills, rushed forward to greet them. "Miss Kincaid. We had given you up for lost when you didn't arrive before the storm, and who is this with you?" "This is Mr. Kade Anderson," Maddie said formally, accepting help to dismount. "He saved my life when my wagon overturned in the blizzard. I owe him everything." Kade dismounted as well, suddenly aware of how they must look Maddie wearing his coat, the two of them having clearly spent several days alone together. But the townspeople seemed more concerned with their survival than with propriety. "You're a hero, Mr. Anderson," Mills declared, pumping his hand enthusiastically. "We need more men like you in these parts." More people gathered around them, asking questions about their ordeal and expressing amazement at their safe arrival. Someone brought hot coffee, and others helped unload Maddie's belongings from Rusty. In the commotion, Kade found himself separated from Maddie. He watched as she was ushered toward the schoolhouse by a group of women, likely the wives of the school board members. She glanced back at him once, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite define. Then she was gone, swallowed up by her new life, and Kade was left standing alone with Rusty. "Come on, boy," he said, leading the tired horse toward the livery stable. "Let's get you settled, then find ourselves a room for the night." The next morning, Kade prepared to leave Fort Benton. He had secured a room at the Montana House, the town's main hotel, and had enjoyed his first hot bath and proper meal in days. Rusty was rested and fed, ready for the journey back to Silver Creek. As he was checking Rusty's saddle in front of the hotel, he heard someone call his name. Turning, he saw Maddie hurrying toward him, her cheeks flushed from the cold or perhaps from exertion. "You're leaving," she said, coming to a stop before him. "It wasn't a question. I need to get back to my wagon in Silver Creek," he explained. "Those supplies won't deliver themselves." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the ground between them. "I just wanted to thank you again and to give you this." She held out his buffalo coat, neatly folded. "It saved my life. I'm grateful." Kade took the coat, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. "Keep it," he said impulsively. "Winter's just beginning, and you'll need it more than me. I've got another at Silver Creek." "I couldn't possibly, please," he insisted. "Consider it a welcome gift to your new home." She hesitated, then took the coat back, holding it against her chest. "Thank you again." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words neither seemed able to speak. Finally, Kade cleared his throat. "I should be back this way in a few weeks. Perhaps I could call on you then, to see how you're settling in." Her face brightened. "I'd like that very much." "Good," he said, smiling. "That's good." Another silence, this one less strained. "Well, I should let you get on your way," Maddie said at last. "The children are expecting me at the schoolhouse, my first day of teaching here." You'll do wonderfully, Kate assured her. Those kids don't know how lucky they are, she smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed her face. Goodbye for now, Kade Anderson, safe travels. Goodbye, Maddie Kincaid, stay warm. He watched her walk away, the buffalo coat draped over her arm, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight. Only when she had turned the corner and disappeared from view did he mount Rusty and point the horse's head toward the trail out of town. The journey back to Silver Creek was uneventful compared to his previous trip. The snow had hardened enough to support Rusty's weight in most places, and the sky remained clear, allowing Kade to make good time. He reached the town by nightfall of the following day. His wagon and supplies were where he had left them, under the watchful eye of the livery stable owner. After ensuring everything was in order, Kade spent a restless night at the town's small hotel, his thoughts repeatedly straying to Maddie and their time in the lined shack. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Kade made his deliveries to the outlying ranches and military posts, navigating the snow-covered trails with the experienced ease of someone who had done it many times before. But despite the familiar routine, he found himself looking forward to his return to Fort Benton with an anticipation that surprised him. When at last his business was concluded, and he was free to choose his next destination, he pointed his wagon toward Fort Benton without hesitation. The journey took 3 days. The weather remaining mercifully stable, Fort Benton had changed little in his absence, though the snow had been cleared from the main streets, and life had returned to its normal rhythm after the disruption of the blizzard. Kade left his wagon at the livery stable and walked to the schoolhouse, timing his arrival for the end of the school day. As he approached, the door opened and children spilled out into the yard, laughing and shouting. Maddie appeared in the doorway, watching them go with a smile. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and her hair was neatly pinned up, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She didn't notice him at first, and Kade took a moment to observe her undetected. She looked happy, he realized, and somehow more vibrant than he remembered. Then one of the children spotted him and pointed, and Maddie turned in his direction. Her face lit up with recognition, and she hurried down the steps toward him, propriety forgotten in her enthusiasm. "Kade, you came back. I said I would," he replied, smiling at her obvious pleasure. "How are you finding life as Fort Benton's schoolteacher?" "Challenging but rewarding," she said, gesturing for him to walk with her. The children are eager to learn, though some of them have had very little formal education before now. They strolled together through the town, Maddie pointing out places of interest and introducing him to people they encountered. Kade was struck by how quickly she had become part of the community and how genuinely the townspeople seemed to like her. "Are you staying in town long?" she asked as they paused near the river, watching the late afternoon sun glint off the water. "A few days, at least," Kade said. "I've got some business with the trading post, but nothing urgent." "Then you must join me for dinner tonight," she insisted. "I've been practicing my cooking skills, though I warn you, they're still somewhat rudimentary." "I'd be honored," he said. "And after beans and jerky in a lined shack, anything you make will taste like a feast," she laughed, the sound carrying across the water. 7 o'clock then. "The schoolhouse has a small kitchen attached to my living quarters." Kade arrived promptly at 7, having taken extra care with his appearance. He had visited the barber for a trim of his hair and beard, and he wore his newest shirt, a deep blue cotton that he normally saved for special occasions. Maddie welcomed him warmly, ushering him into her small but cozy living quarters. The space was simply furnished, but already bore her personal touches, books stacked on every available surface, a colorful quilt draped over the back of a chair, and wildflowers arranged in a jar on the table. "It's not much," she said, noticing his inspection, "but it's home now." "It suits you," Kade said honestly. Dinner was simple but delicious: venison stew, cornbread, and apple pie for dessert. They talked easily, picking up where they had left off weeks before, sharing stories of what had happened in their lives since they parted. "The school board was quite intrigued by our adventure," Maddie confessed as they sat by her small fireplace after dinner, each with a cup of coffee. I think they expected me to be a prim and proper Eastern lady who would faint at the first sign of hardship. You certainly proved them wrong, Cade chuckled. Not many women or men, for that matter, would have survived what you did. What we did, she corrected him gently. I wouldn't be here if not for you. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something electric passed between them. Cade found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn to her without conscious decision. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks, and the moment broke. Maddie looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. It's getting late, she said, her voice slightly unsteady, and I have school tomorrow. Of course, Cade said, standing. Thank you for dinner. It was wonderful. At the door they hesitated, neither quite ready for the evening to end. Will I see you again before you leave town? Maddie asked. If you'd like to, Cade replied, watching her face carefully. I would, she said simply, very much. Over the next few days, they spent what time they could together. Cade would wait for her after school, and they would walk through town or along the river. Sometimes they talked for hours, other times they were content with comfortable silence. On the evening before Cade was scheduled to leave, they sat on a bench overlooking the Missouri, watching the sunset paint the water with gold and crimson. I've been thinking, Cade said after a long silence. My work takes me through Fort Benton regularly. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to call on you whenever I'm in town. Maddie turned to face him, her expression serious. I'd like that. But Cade, I need to know, what exactly are you proposing? He took a deep breath, recognizing the importance of the moment. I'm proposing that we get to know each other better, that we see where this connection between us might lead, if you're amenable, of course. She studied him, her blue eyes searching his face. And if I am amenable, what then? Then I'd consider myself the luckiest man in Montana territory. A slow smile spread across her face. In that case, Mr. Anderson, I believe I am quite amenable. The months that followed established a pattern. Cade would return to Fort Benton every few weeks, staying for several days before his work took him elsewhere. Each visit deepened their connection, and by the time spring arrived, bringing with it wildflowers and longer days, there was no denying the feelings that had grown between them. It was on a mild April evening, with the scent of new growth in the air, that Cade finally found the courage to speak his heart. They had ridden out to a meadow outside of town, a picnic basket secured to Cade's saddle. Rusty grazed contentedly nearby as they spread a blanket on the new grass and unpacked their meal. Do you ever think about the blizzard? Cade asked as they sat side by side, watching clouds drift across the blue sky. Often, Maddie admitted. It changed everything for me. Not just because of the danger, but because it brought you into my life. I've been thinking about it too, Cade said, turning to face her, about how sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes. He took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Maddie, I never expected to find someone like you, someone who makes me want to be better, who challenges me and accepts me just as I am. I love you. I think I have since that first night in the line shack, though I didn't recognize it then. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she was smiling. I love you too, Cade. I think I knew it when you wrapped me in your coat and carried me through that storm, though I was too cold and frightened to understand it at the time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. I've been carrying this with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Unfolding the cloth revealed a ring, a simple gold band with a small, perfect sapphire that matched the color of her eyes. Madeline Kincaid, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? She stared at the ring, then at him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Kade Anderson, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and passion that had been building between them for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Maddie rested her forehead against his. Where will we live? Your work takes you all over the territory, and I have my teaching position here. I've been thinking about that too, Cade said, stroking her hair. I've saved enough to buy a small ranch just outside of Fort Benton. It needs work, but it could be a good home, a place to build a life together. I could still make deliveries seasonally, but I'd be home more, with you. A ranch, Maddie repeated, her eyes wide with surprise. You do that for me, for us, he corrected gently. I've been a wanderer long enough, Maddie. It's time to put down roots. And there's nowhere I'd rather do that than with you. The wedding took place in June, with the whole town in attendance. The schoolhouse was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, and Maddie wore a dress of pale blue silk that her students had helped her sew. Kade, looking unusually formal in a new suit, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such joy and wonder that several of the town's older ladies dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The couple exchanged vows under an arbor of spring branches, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever storms life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kade swept Maddie into his arms for a kiss that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings, propriety be damned. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the town square, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Mrs. Anderson, Kade said, leading his bride in a dance. How does it sound? Wonderful, Maddie replied, her eyes shining with happiness. Though the children at school may need time to adjust to the change. They'll have plenty of time, he assured her. I'm not planning on going anywhere without you ever again. Their honeymoon was a 2-week journey to Helena, the territorial capital, where they stayed in the finest hotel and explored the growing city. For Maddie, who had never traveled west of Fort Benton, it was an adventure nearly as exciting as their first meeting in the blizzard. Upon their return, they moved into the ranch Kade had purchased. The house was small but sturdy, situated on a rise that overlooked a creek and offered views of distant mountains. With Maddie's touch, it soon became a true home, filled with books and comfortable furniture and the scent of fresh baked bread. Kade worked tirelessly to improve the property, building corrals and outbuildings, planting a garden at Maddie's request, and slowly acquiring a small herd of cattle. He still made occasional delivery runs during the milder months, but he always returned to Maddie with stories to share and gifts from the towns he visited. Maddie continued teaching, riding to and from town each day on a gentle mare Kade had given her as a wedding present. Her students adored her, and the school board repeatedly expressed their gratitude for her dedication and skill. The following spring, as the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Maddie had news of her own to share. They were sitting on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kade had his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him in comfortable intimacy. I've been thinking, Maddie said, her voice soft but excited. The upstairs room, the small one next to ours, I think it would make a perfect nursery. Kade went very still beside her. A nursery, he repeated, his voice barely audible. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. Yes, a nursery for our child, who should arrive sometime in late autumn, according to the doctor in town. For a moment, Kade couldn't speak. Then he let out a whoop of joy that startled the chickens in the nearby coop, lifting Maddie from her seat and spinning her around, her laughter joining his in the quiet evening air. A baby, he said when he finally set her down, his hands cradling her face. Our baby, our family, she corrected, her eyes filled with love, the one we're building together. That night, as they lay in bed, Kade's hand resting protectively over the still flat plane of her stomach, he whispered, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been on that trail that day, if the blizzard had come an hour earlier or later? Sometimes, Maddie admitted. But then I remember something my father used to say, that the important things in life find their way to us one way or another, if not that day, then another, if not that trail, then a different one. Kade considered this, then nodded slowly. I'd like to think that's true. That somehow, some way we were meant to find each other. We did find each other, she reminded him, snuggling closer, and now we're creating a future together. That's what matters. Catherine Margaret Anderson was born on a crisp October day, with her father pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the midwife finally allowed him entry. When Kade first held his daughter, A tiny bundle with a shock of auburn hair and eyes that promised to be as blue as her mother's. He felt a love so overwhelming it brought him to his knees beside Maddie's bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully passing the baby back to his exhausted but radiant wife. "Just like her mother. She has your chin," Maddie observed, touching the baby's face with a gentle finger. "And I suspect she'll have your stubborn streak as well." "Heaven help us all if that's true," Kade laughed softly. Life settled into a new rhythm with Catherine's arrival. Maddie took a leave from teaching until spring, focusing on their daughter and the household. Kade cut back further on his delivery routes, unwilling to miss any of his child's early milestones. The winter that followed was mild compared to the one that had brought them together, but on the anniversary of that fateful day, a snowstorm blew in from the north, not as severe but enough to keep them housebound. "It's like the weather is reminding us," Maddie said as they sat before the fire, Catherine sleeping peacefully in a cradle Kade had crafted himself. "As if we could forget," Kade replied, pulling her closer to his side. "Though I prefer being snowed in with you under these circumstances. With heat and a proper bed and no fear of freezing to death," she teased. "And with our daughter," he added, his gaze moving tenderly to the cradle. "Our family." The years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Catherine was joined by a brother, James, 2 years later, and then by another sister, Elizabeth, the year after that. The ranch prospered, as did Fort Benton, growing from a frontier outpost to a proper town with a church, several stores, and even a small theater. Maddie eventually returned to teaching part-time, bringing the younger children with her when necessary. Kade expanded their land holdings, built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, and became known throughout the territory as a fair and honest businessman. Through it all, their love deepened, weathering the inevitable storms of life illnesses, financial worries, the occasional disagreement. They faced each challenge together, stronger for having found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kade surprised Maddie with a trip back to the line shack where they had sheltered during the blizzard. He had purchased the land it stood on and had the cabin restored, though it remained as simple and rustic as it had been that first night. "Why here?" Maddie asked as they approached on horseback, the familiar outline of the cabin bringing back a flood of memories. "Because this is where our story began," Kade said, "and I wanted to show you something." Inside, the cabin had been cleaned and furnished with a new stove, comfortable chairs, and a proper bed. But what caught Maddie's attention was the plaque mounted beside the door, engraved with words that made her heart swell. "In this place, a blizzard brought together two souls destined to find each other. Kade and Madeline Anderson, January 12, 1875, love born in the storm." "Oh, Kade," she whispered, turning to embrace him. "It's perfect." They spent the night in the cabin, reminiscing about their first meeting and marveling at the path their lives had taken. In the morning, they rode back to their ranch, where their children awaited them, eager to hear stories of their parents' adventure. Catherine, now 9 and as curious as her mother had been at her age, never tired of the tale. "Tell us again, Papa," she begged as they gathered around the fire that evening. "About the blizzard and how you saved Mama." "Well," Kade began, winking at Maddie, "it was the worst storm in years. The blizzard devoured the ridge trail, turning day to night in minutes. I was a fool to be out in it, but sometimes foolishness leads to the best things in life." He went on to describe finding the overturned wagon, the dead horse, and Maddie huddled against the cold. "The cowboy wrapped a woman in his coat and walked," he said, using the phrase that had become something of a family legend. "And somehow they both survived to build this life we have now." Later, when the children were asleep, Kade and Maddie stood on their porch, looking out at the land that had become their home. The moon cast a silver glow over the pastures and outbuildings, the creek and the distant mountains. "Did you ever imagine this?" Maddie asked, her arm around his waist, her head on his shoulder. "That day in the blizzard, did you ever think we'd be here like this?" Kade considered the question seriously. "No," he admitted. "I was just trying to get us both through alive." But somewhere along the way in that lined shack, something changed. I started to see a future I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. And now here we are, she said softly, living that future. Here we are, he agreed, turning to kiss her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. And I wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that brought us here. As if to punctuate his words, a light snow began to fall. Gentle flakes drifting down from the night sky, not a blizzard this time, but a reminder of how the forces of nature had conspired to bring them together. They stood watching the snow for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the storm that had changed their lives and the love that had sustained them through all the seasons since.